I've been working as a train conductor in Sweden for a few years now. It's a job I'm grateful for, as it allows me to provide for my 2 young boys. But one night, I encountered a passenger who made my blood run cold. It was a late-night train, and most of the passengers had already disembarked. I was making my rounds, checking to make sure everyone had left, when I saw him. He was a tall, thin man with sunken eyes and a wild look on his face. He was wearing a long black coat, and his hands were hidden in the pockets. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew something was off about him. As I approached, he looked up and stared directly into my eyes. I could feel his gaze piercing through me, and I felt my knees go weak. "Excuse me, sir, the train has reached its final destination. We need to disembark now," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. He didn't reply. Instead, he just continued to stare at me, his eyes unblinking. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," I repeated, my voice shaking slightly. That's when he finally spoke. His voice was low and raspy, sending chills down my spine. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and I could feel his hot breath on my face. I was terrified. I knew I wasn't physically strong enough to take him on, but I couldn't just leave him on the train. I had to think of something. "Sir, please. You have to leave. I have to lock up the train for the night," I said, hoping to appeal to his sense of reason. But he just chuckled, a low, menacing sound that made my blood run cold. "You can't make me leave," he said, and I knew he was right. I couldn't force him to do anything. I was at his mercy. I was about to give up when I had an idea. I remembered that there was a security guard stationed at the station. If I could just get to him, he could help me get this man off the train. I made a show of checking the doors and then quickly made my way to the station. As soon as I got off the train, I sprinted to the security guard and told him everything. The 2 of us made our way back to the train, but when we got there, the man was gone. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of him. To this day, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I know that I never want to encounter him again. I was on a train from New York to Boston for a job interview, and the train was packed. I had managed to snag a window seat, but the man next to me was big, with a thick beard and a gruff demeanor. He had a newspaper open in front of him, and he didn't seem interested in small talk. I settled into my seat, scrolling through my phone as the train chugged along. About an hour into the journey, I noticed the man next to me was staring at me. His eyes bore into me, making me feel uncomfortable. I tried to ignore him and focus on my phone, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. Suddenly, he leaned over and whispered in my ear, "I know what you're doing." I froze, not sure what he meant. He continued to stare at me, a sinister grin on his face. I felt like he was trying to intimidate me, and it was working. The train stopped at a station, and I quickly gathered my things and made a beeline for the bathroom. I locked the door behind me and took a few deep breaths. When I emerged, the man was waiting for me. "You can't hide from me," he said, grabbing my arm. "I know what you're up to." I yanked my arm away and ran down the aisle, searching for a conductor or someone to help me. But the train was crowded, and no one seemed to notice my distress. The man followed me, whispering threats and insults in my ear. I knew I had to do something, so I dug into my bag and pulled out a can of pepper spray. I turned around and sprayed him in the face, and he stumbled back, clutching his eyes and screaming in pain. I ran to the front of the train and told the conductor what had happened. They called the police, and the man was arrested when we arrived in Boston. It was a terrifying experience, and I still have nightmares about it. But I'm grateful to have made it out alive, and I'll never forget the importance of staying vigilant and prepared for the unexpected. I was on my way home from visiting my family in the city, taking the late-night train back to my small town. It was a quiet ride, with only a few other passengers in my car. I settled into my seat, looking forward to a peaceful trip. As the train started moving, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was wearing a dark hoodie and had his head down, so I couldn't see his face. He was holding a backpack tightly in his lap, and I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. After a few minutes, I pulled out my book and started reading, trying to ignore the feeling of unease. But something kept pulling my attention back to the man across from me. Every time I looked up, he was still sitting there, his head down and his backpack clutched tightly. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop, and the lights flickered off. The car was plunged into darkness, and I heard the sound of the doors opening. I looked up and saw the man across from me quickly get up and run out of the car. Panic set in as I realized that the train had stopped in the middle of nowhere, and the only person in the car with me was the mysterious man who had just fled. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. I sat in the dark, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, the train started moving again. I was relieved, but also terrified. What had happened? Was the man who had been sitting across from me responsible for the train stopping? As the train pulled into my station, I quickly got off and ran to my car, never looking back. I reported the incident to the train company, but they didn't find anything suspicious on the train. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. But I'll never forget the feeling of being alone in the dark with a stranger who may have had sinister intentions. I was on a train, heading home from a weekend getaway. It was a long journey, and the train was almost empty. I had a compartment to myself and was settled in, reading a book. That's when I noticed the man. He was sitting across from me, staring intently. He was wearing a dark suit, had a neatly trimmed beard, and a sharp look in his eyes. I tried to ignore him and went back to my book, but I could feel his gaze on me. After a while, he got up and left the compartment. I breathed a sigh of relief and went back to my book. But he returned shortly after, carrying a small, black suitcase. He sat down next to me this time, and I could smell a faint scent of cologne. "Excuse me," he said in a low, calm voice. "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" I looked up and nodded, trying to hide my discomfort. "I'm looking for someone," he continued. "A young woman, with brown hair and green eyes. Have you seen anyone like that on this train?" I shook my head, feeling a chill run down my spine. He smiled at me, but it was cold and calculating. "Thank you," he said, and got up to leave. I watched him go, feeling relieved. But my relief was short-lived. As the train started to slow down, I saw the same man standing on the platform, watching me as the train passed him by. The same thing happened at every stop. He would get off the train, and I would see him waiting for me as we passed by. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew that I was in danger. When the train finally pulled into my station, I grabbed my bags and bolted for the door. But he was there, waiting for me. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me towards him. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and menacing. I screamed, drawing the attention of nearby commuters. The man let go of me and disappeared into the crowd. I reported the incident to the police, but they never found him. To this day, I still have nightmares about that train journey, and I always make sure to be extra cautious when traveling alone. I boarded the late-night train, relieved to have found a seat. I had been traveling all day and was exhausted. As I settled in, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out jacket. I nodded politely and pulled out my book, eager to pass the time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching me. Every time I looked up, his eyes would meet mine, and he would smile. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my book. But when I looked up again, he was staring directly at me. I felt my heart race as he stood up and walked towards me. "Do you mind if I sit next to you?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment but eventually nodded. The man sat down next to me, and I could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath. I felt uneasy but tried to remain calm. We sat in silence for a while, and I tried to return to my book. But then, the man reached out and touched my arm. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice slurred. I tried to pull away, but his grip was firm. "Please let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. The man laughed and leaned in closer. "Relax, baby. I just want to talk." I knew then that I was in danger. I grabbed my bag and stood up, ready to make a run for it. But the man grabbed my arm, pulling me back down onto the seat. "Where do you think you're going?" he said, his grip tightening. I screamed for help, but the train was empty, and there was no one around. I could feel the man's breath on my neck as he leaned in closer. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stood up and walked away. I was left alone, shaken and terrified. It took me a long time to recover from that experience, but I'm grateful that I made it out alive. I never take my safety for granted anymore, and I'm always on the lookout for danger. You never know what kind of people you'll meet on a train. I was on my way home from a long day at work, sitting in a nearly empty train carriage. It was late at night, and I was one of only a few passengers left. I had my headphones in, listening to music and trying to relax, when I noticed a man had sat down across from me. He was wearing a black hoodie and had a backpack slung over his shoulder. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but I started to feel uneasy as he kept staring at me. It was as if he was trying to intimidate me, and I could feel his eyes burning into me. I tried to ignore him, hoping he would get off at the next stop, but he stayed on. I started to feel nervous, and my heart rate increased as I realized we were the only two people left in the carriage. The train rattled on, the only sound the screeching of metal against the tracks. As we entered a dark tunnel, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the carriage into darkness. I could hear the man's breathing getting louder and more erratic, and I knew I had to act fast. I quickly pulled out my phone and dialed 911, holding it close to my ear. I then shouted at the man, "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer, but instead reached into his backpack and pulled out a knife. My heart raced as I tried to stay calm, pretending to talk to the 911 dispatcher while giving them details about my situation. I begged the man to put down the knife, telling him I had alerted the authorities. After what felt like an eternity, the train finally screeched to a stop, and I sprinted out of the carriage and onto the platform, still holding onto my phone and pretending to talk to the dispatcher. The man was arrested, and I later found out he had a history of violent crimes. I couldn't believe how close I had come to being his next victim. I never take public transport at night anymore, and I always stay aware of my surroundings. I was on a train, making my way home from a weekend trip. It was late at night, and the car was nearly empty. I settled into my seat and pulled out a book, eager to pass the time. As the train pulled out of the station, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. I didn't think much of it and went back to my book. But something about him made me uneasy. He was staring at me, his eyes locked onto mine. I tried to ignore him, but his gaze was unnerving. I decided to move to another seat, hoping to distance myself from him. But as I got up, he grabbed my arm. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. I could feel his breath on my face, and I knew I was in trouble. Suddenly, the train lurched and I stumbled backward. The man lost his grip on me, and I ran to the next car. I could hear him chasing me, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. I locked myself in the bathroom and tried to calm my racing heart. But then I heard the door creaking open, and I knew he had followed me. I braced myself for the worst, but to my surprise, it was the conductor who had entered the bathroom. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing the terror on my face. I told him what had happened, and he immediately called for backup. The man was arrested, and I was taken to the next station to give a statement to the police. I never found out what the man's intentions were, but I knew that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. From that day forward, I made sure to always be aware of my surroundings, even when I was in a seemingly safe place like a train. I boarded the train to visit my family, excited for a long-awaited reunion. As I settled into my seat, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was older, with deep wrinkles etched into his weathered face, and he wore a faded denim jacket over a tattered flannel shirt. He stared at me intently, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore him and pulled out a book to read, but I could feel his gaze on me the entire time. Every time I looked up, he was still staring, his eyes unwavering. As the train began to move, the man stood up and moved closer to me. He leaned in and whispered, "I've been watching you. You're going to be mine." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to move away, but he grabbed my wrist and pulled me close. "Don't try to run," he said, his breath hot on my face. "You won't get away from me." I could feel panic rising within me, but I knew I had to stay calm. I tried to reason with him, to talk him out of whatever he had planned. But he just laughed and tightened his grip. As the train rattled on, I searched for a way out. I looked around for someone to help me, but the other passengers seemed oblivious to what was happening. I realized I was on my own. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop, throwing the man off balance. In that moment, I seized my chance and broke free. I ran down the aisle, my heart racing, and I could hear the man's footsteps behind me. I made it to the next car and slammed the door behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. I could hear the man pounding on the door, but I knew I was safe for the time being. The rest of the journey was nerve-wracking, but I made it to my destination without incident. I never saw the man again, but I'll never forget the fear I felt on that train. It's a reminder to always be aware of my surroundings and to trust my instincts. I was on my way home from a weekend trip to visit family, and I was taking the train. It was a long journey, and I was looking forward to getting some much-needed rest. As the train pulled away from the station, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was wearing a long coat and a fedora hat, and his face was obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to ignore him and settled in for the ride. But every time I looked up, he was still staring at me. I began to feel uneasy and wished I had chosen a different seat. As the train rumbled on, the man got up and walked down the aisle. He didn't stop until he reached the end of the car and disappeared into the next one. I breathed a sigh of relief and tried to relax. but then, I heard a sound coming from the other car. It was a low, guttural growl, and it sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, the man burst into my car, and he was no longer alone. Behind him was a pack of snarling, drooling dogs. They were mangy and emaciated, their eyes wild with hunger. I froze, unsure of what to do. The man smiled at me, revealing a mouthful of sharp, pointed teeth. He stepped forward, and I could feel the dogs closing in on me. But just as I thought it was all over, the train lurched to a stop. The conductor burst into the car, holding a can of pepper spray. He sprayed the dogs, sending them yelping and howling back into the other car. The man tried to escape, but the conductor tackled him to the ground. It turns out he was a known criminal, wanted for multiple counts of animal cruelty. I was shaken, but relieved to be alive. I made it home safely, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those cold, hungry eyes on me. It was a ride I would never forget. I was on my way home from a business trip, taking the late train back to my hometown. The train was mostly empty, with only a few other passengers scattered throughout the car. I settled into my seat and closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest before reaching my destination. I must have dozed off, because when I woke up, I realized that I was the only one left on the train. It was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the train rolled into a tunnel, the lights flickered and went out. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight app. That's when I saw him. A man was standing at the end of the car, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. He wore a tattered trench coat and had a large, rusty knife in his hand. I froze in terror, not sure what to do. The man started to walk toward me, his footsteps echoing through the empty train car. I tried to stay calm, knowing that I needed to think fast if I wanted to survive. I remembered that I had a small can of pepper spray in my bag, and I fumbled for it in the dark. The man was getting closer, his knife glinting in the faint light of my phone. I took a deep breath and sprayed the pepper spray directly into his face. The man stumbled back, coughing and choking. I seized my opportunity and bolted for the door. I ran down the empty platform and out into the night air, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. It wasn't until the next day that I learned that the police had caught the man. He was a known serial killer who had been on the run for months. I shuddered at the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't had that can of pepper spray with me. I was on a long train ride home from visiting family. The train was packed, and I was stuck in a cramped seat next to a stranger. As the train rumbled on through the night, I started to doze off. I was jolted awake by a sudden movement next to me. The stranger was now standing in the aisle, looking down at me with a strange expression on his face. He was wearing a hoodie, and his face was partially hidden in the shadows. "Excuse me, can I help you?" I asked, feeling uneasy. The stranger didn't say anything, but he handed me a small, folded note. I hesitated for a moment before taking it from him. As he walked away, I unfolded the note and read what it said. "I know what you did. I'm watching you." My heart started racing as I looked around the train car, trying to see if the stranger was still there. But he had disappeared. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a sick prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the train pulled into the next station, I saw the stranger again, standing at the end of the platform. He was staring directly at me, his face still hidden in the shadows of his hoodie. I got off the train at the next stop, feeling scared and vulnerable. But I didn't see the stranger again. I thought that maybe it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. But then, a few days later, I received a package in the mail. It was a note, written in the same handwriting as the first one, along with a photo of me on the train. I had never felt so violated. I reported it to the police, but they never found the stranger. To this day, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted from me. But I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, and I always make sure to keep an eye out for any suspicious strangers on public transportation. I had a long day at work, and all I wanted to do was relax on the train ride home. The train was crowded, and I had to stand in the aisle. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes, listening to music on my headphones. After a few minutes, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I opened my eyes and saw an old man standing in front of me. He was wearing a tattered brown coat and had a wild look in his eyes. "Excuse me," he said. "Can I ask you a question?" I nodded, trying to be polite. "Do you believe in God?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm not sure," I said. "Why do you ask?" The old man's eyes lit up. "I have a message from God for you," he said. "He wants you to know that your life is in danger." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. The old man leaned in close and whispered, "There's someone on this train who wants to hurt you. They've been watching you for a while now." I looked around the train, trying to see if anyone was looking at me. But everyone seemed to be minding their own business. The old man continued to ramble on about God's message, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. I was too busy scanning the train for any signs of danger. As the train pulled into my stop, the old man grabbed my arm. "Be careful," he said. "God is watching over you, but you still need to be careful." I thanked him and quickly got off the train. I walked home, constantly looking over my shoulder and feeling paranoid. But nothing happened. I told my friend about the strange encounter on the train, and she suggested I report it to the authorities. I did, and the police were able to track down the old man. It turned out he had a history of mental illness and was known for making bizarre claims. Although I was relieved to know the old man was harmless, the incident still gave me chills. It was a stark reminder that danger can lurk anywhere, even on a crowded train. I boarded the train at the station, looking forward to a long, relaxing journey to my hometown. As I settled into my seat, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was dressed in a black suit and tie, with a fedora pulled low over his eyes. He seemed to be staring at me intently, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and pulled out my book to read. But every time I looked up, the man was still staring at me. I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. As the train chugged along, the man got up and walked down the aisle. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking he had left me alone. But then he stopped in front of my seat and leaned in close. "You're going to die tonight," he whispered, before turning and walking away. I was paralyzed with fear. Was this man a serial killer? Was he going to harm me? I couldn't get his words out of my head. I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking up, expecting to see the man coming back for me. The hours ticked by, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. As we approached my stop, I gathered my belongings and prepared to get off the train. But before I could move, the man appeared in front of me again. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to scare you. I'm a psychic, and I had a vision that something bad was going to happen to you tonight. I wanted to warn you." I was relieved but still shaken. The man handed me his card, and I got off the train, grateful to be alive. But I couldn't help wondering, what if he had been telling the truth? What if I hadn't been so lucky? I boarded the train late at night, the only passenger in my carriage. I was exhausted after a long day at work and was looking forward to the hour-long journey home. As the train started moving, I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. But something was off. I could sense someone watching me, and every time I opened my eyes, I saw a man staring at me from the opposite end of the carriage. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a beanie pulled low over his forehead. His eyes were dark and piercing, and he made no effort to hide his gaze. I tried to ignore him and went back to my half-asleep state. But the feeling of being watched persisted, and I couldn't shake it off. When I opened my eyes again, the man had moved closer to me, and I could see his lips moving. He was muttering something, but I couldn't make out the words. I got up and moved to the other end of the carriage, hoping to put some distance between us. But the man followed me, his eyes still fixed on me. He sat down across from me and continued muttering under his breath. I was starting to panic. There was no one else on the train, and I felt trapped. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that he was probably just a harmless eccentric. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew something was wrong. I got up again and moved to the next carriage, hoping to find some other passengers. But as I turned the corner, I saw the same man standing there, blocking my path. His eyes were wide open, and he was now speaking loudly in a foreign language. I froze, unsure of what to do. But then I remembered my phone and quickly dialed the emergency number. As I spoke to the operator, the man backed away, and I heard him exit the train at the next stop. When I got off at my stop, I was shaking with fear. But I was relieved to have made it home safely. I never found out who the man was or what he wanted. But I knew I would never forget that night on the train. I was on a train ride home from a weekend trip. It was a late-night train, and I had snagged a seat by the window. As the train chugged along, I watched the darkness outside, lost in my own thoughts. That's when I heard a strange sound coming from the seat behind me. It was a low, guttural growl, like an animal's warning. I turned around, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I tried to ignore the sound and focus on my book, but the growling grew louder and more persistent. I turned around again, but still, there was nothing there. I began to feel uneasy, like something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I started to pack up my things, ready to move to another seat. That's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes in the darkness, staring straight at me. They were bright and fierce, like a predator's. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I had to get out of there. I got up to move, but as I did, the creature lunged at me. It was a wild dog, its fur matted and its eyes filled with fury. I screamed and ran to the other end of the train, but the dog followed me, barking and growling. I was trapped, with nowhere to go. That's when a group of passengers emerged from the next car, armed with broomsticks and flashlights. They managed to scare the dog off, and I collapsed onto the floor, shaking with fear and adrenaline. As the train pulled into the station, the passengers helped me off and made sure I was okay. I realized then that I was lucky to be alive. If it weren't for their quick thinking and bravery, I might not have made it off that train. I was on my way home from a long day at work, on a late-night train that was nearly empty. I sat down in a window seat, put on my headphones, and started scrolling through my phone. As the train pulled out of the station, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was staring at me intently, his eyes fixed on me as if he was trying to read my thoughts. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to avoid eye contact with the man. But every time I looked up, he was still staring at me. I tried to focus on my music, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. The man got up and started walking towards me. My heart raced as he leaned in close and whispered, "You're in danger." I was frozen in fear, unable to speak or move. The man pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to me. "Take this," he said, "it's a warning." The paper was a newspaper article about a string of robberies and assaults that had been happening on trains in the area. The man pointed to a picture of a suspect, and said, "That's the guy. He's on this train, and he's been watching you." My blood ran cold as I realized that the man had been trying to protect me. I thanked him and he got off at the next stop, leaving me alone on the train with my thoughts. I looked around the empty carriage, wondering if the suspect was still on board. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt and the lights went out. I heard footsteps coming towards me, and I knew that the suspect had found me. I tried to remain calm as the man approached me, demanding my wallet and phone. But I remembered the newspaper article and the warning from the stranger. With all the strength I could muster, I fought back and managed to escape his grasp. The train eventually pulled into my station, and I ran out onto the platform, heart racing and hands shaking. I turned around and saw the suspect being apprehended by the police. I was safe, but the memory of that night still haunts me to this day. I was on my way back home from a long day at work. The train was mostly empty, except for a few passengers scattered here and there. I had just settled into my seat and put my headphones on when I noticed a man staring at me from across the aisle. He was wearing a worn-out coat and had a scruffy beard. He looked like he hadn't bathed in days. I tried to ignore him and looked out the window, but I could feel his eyes on me. After a few minutes, he got up and came over to my seat. "Excuse me, miss," he said, "but do you have a moment to talk?" I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. He sat down next to me and introduced himself as John. He told me that he was homeless and had been on the streets for months. He said he was trying to get back on his feet and was hoping to find a job. I listened to his story and felt sorry for him. We chatted for a while, and he seemed like a decent guy. But then he started asking me personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, where I worked, and what my plans were for the weekend. I started to feel uncomfortable and told him I had to go. He seemed disappointed but didn't protest. I breathed a sigh of relief and went back to my music. A few minutes later, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was John again. "Miss, I'm sorry to bother you again, but I forgot to give you something." He handed me a crumpled piece of paper and got off the train at the next stop. I unfolded the paper and saw that it was a note with my name and address written on it. My heart sank. I had no idea how he had gotten my information. I looked around the train, but he was nowhere to be seen. I got off the train at my stop and quickly walked home. I locked the doors and windows and checked the locks twice. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Over the next few weeks, I kept a low profile and avoided taking the train. But one day, I saw John again, lurking outside my office building. I called the police, and they apprehended him. It turned out he had been following me for weeks, tracking my movements, and gathering personal information. It was a wake-up call for me. I learned to be more vigilant and cautious around strangers. I never want to feel as helpless and scared as I did on that train again. I boarded the train, exhausted after a long day of work. It was a late-night ride, and the train was nearly empty. I found a seat near the back and settled in, hoping to catch some rest before my stop. As the train began to move, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a serious expression. He was dressed in a black suit and had a briefcase at his feet. I nodded politely, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at me with his dark, intense eyes. I shifted in my seat, feeling uneasy, but tried to ignore him and closed my eyes. I must have dozed off, because when I woke up, the train was still moving, but the man was gone. I felt relieved and settled back into my seat, but then I heard a strange noise. It was a low growl, almost like a dog. I looked around, but there was no one there. The noise grew louder, and I felt a cold breeze on my neck. That's when I realized that the window next to me was open, even though it had been closed before. I got up to close the window, but as I did, I heard the growling again. I turned around, and there he was, the man in the black suit. His eyes were wild, and his teeth were bared like an animal's. I tried to back away, but he lunged at me. I screamed and ran down the aisle, but he chased after me. I could hear his footsteps pounding on the floor, and I knew I had to act fast. I saw a conductor up ahead and ran towards him, yelling for help. The man in the suit backed off, and I collapsed into the conductor's arms, panting and crying. The conductor called the police, and they arrested the man. It turned out he was a dangerous criminal who had escaped from a nearby prison. He had been hiding on the train, waiting for his chance to strike. I shuddered to think what might have happened if I hadn't woken up in time. I was lucky to be alive, and I knew I would never forget that terrifying ride on the train. I was taking the late-night train home from a business trip, exhausted and ready to get some sleep. The train was almost empty, and I had a row of seats to myself. I closed my eyes and let myself relax, feeling the train's gentle sway lull me to sleep. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name. I opened my eyes, but there was no one there. I brushed it off as my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. But the whispers continued, and I could feel someone's breath on my neck. I turned around, but there was no one behind me. I started to feel uneasy and decided to move to a different seat. As I gathered my things, I saw a man sitting a few rows behind me, staring at me intently. He was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and piercing blue eyes. I didn't recognize him from the train, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I moved to a seat closer to the front of the train, hoping to get some distance from the strange man. But he followed me, sitting in the seat directly across from me. He continued to stare at me, never blinking, never saying a word. I tried to ignore him and focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching my every move. The train made a sudden jolt, and the man's foot brushed against mine. It was just a small touch, but it sent shivers down my spine. I got up to move again, but the man grabbed my arm, his grip tight and unyielding. I panicked and screamed for help, but no one came. The man started to pull me towards him, and I knew I had to act fast. I kicked him as hard as I could and ran towards the nearest exit. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air. I looked back and saw the man staring at me through the train window, a look of pure hatred on his face. I reported the incident to the authorities, and they later told me that the man was a known criminal with a history of assault. I was lucky to have gotten away unharmed. Since then, I've never taken a train alone at night, and I always stay alert and aware of my surroundings. It was a scary experience, but I learned that sometimes, your instincts are your best defense. I was on my way home from a long day at work, taking the train like I always did. It was a late night, and the train was mostly empty. I sat by myself, listening to music and trying to unwind. That's when I noticed him. A man sitting across from me, staring intently. He was bald, with piercing blue eyes and a menacing grin. I tried to ignore him, but he kept staring, never breaking eye contact. I looked around the train car, but there was no one else there. I started to feel uneasy, like something wasn't right. The man got up and walked towards me, still grinning. He sat down right next to me, invading my personal space. "I've been watching you," he said, his breath hot on my neck. I tried to move away, but he was too close. I could feel his body pressed against mine, his hand brushing against my leg. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. Then he whispered something in my ear that chilled me to the bone. "You're going to come with me, and you're not going to make a sound." I knew then that I had to act fast. I kicked him as hard as I could and ran towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him chasing me, but I managed to escape onto the platform. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the train, but the man was nowhere to be found. I never saw him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching and waiting. It's been years since that night, but I still have nightmares about it. I never take the train alone anymore, and I always keep my guard up. I may have lived to tell the tale, but the memory of that man will haunt me forever. I was on a late-night train, traveling alone from one city to another. The carriage was almost empty, with only a few other passengers scattered throughout. I sat near the front, with my headphones on, lost in my own world. As the train chugged along, I felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I looked up and saw a man staring at me from the other end of the carriage. He was tall and lanky, with greasy hair and a patchy beard. I tried to ignore him and went back to my music, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. A few minutes later, I looked up again, and the man was closer, now sitting just a few seats away from me. He was still staring at me, but now he was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was cold and calculated, like he was planning something. I decided to move to another seat, hoping to distance myself from the man. But every time I looked up, he seemed to be getting closer. I tried to reason with myself, thinking maybe he was just a harmless weirdo, but my instincts told me otherwise. Finally, the train came to a stop at my destination, and I got up to leave. As I walked towards the door, the man stood up and followed me. He was only a few steps behind me, and I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. I knew I had to act fast, so I spun around and pushed him away. He stumbled back, surprised by my sudden movement. I ran out of the train and onto the platform, my heart racing. As I looked back, I saw the man standing at the door, still staring at me. I knew I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation, and I vowed never to take the train alone again. I was on the train home from a long day at work. The car was mostly empty, and I was sitting in the back, minding my own business. That's when I noticed a man sitting a few rows ahead of me. He was wearing a hoodie, and his face was obscured by the shadows. At first, I didn't think anything of it. But as the train pulled into the next station, the man got up and moved closer to me. I felt my heart rate increase, but I tried to remain calm. Maybe he was just getting off at the same stop as me. But as the train pulled out of the station, the man sat down in the seat across from me. He didn't say anything, he just stared at me with a blank expression. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The train started to pick up speed, and the man leaned in closer to me. I could smell his breath, and it was foul. He started muttering under his breath, and I could barely make out what he was saying. It sounded like he was reciting some kind of ritualistic chant. I was starting to panic, and I knew I had to get away from him. I got up and walked to the other end of the car, hoping he wouldn't follow me. But he did. He got up and started walking towards me, his eyes fixed on me like a predator stalking its prey. I knew I had to act fast. I pulled out my phone and pretended to call the police. "Yeah, there's a guy on the train who's making me feel really uncomfortable," I said, trying to sound as convincing as possible. "Can you send someone to meet me at the next station?" To my relief, the man stopped in his tracks and backed away. He got off at the next station, and I never saw him again. I never found out what his intentions were, but I knew that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation. It's a sobering reminder that danger can be lurking around any corner, even on a seemingly harmless train ride. I was on a train ride home after a long day at work. It was late at night, and I was the only one in my compartment. As the train rumbled down the tracks, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Something felt off. Suddenly, the door to my compartment slid open, and a man stumbled in. He was disheveled, with wild hair and bloodshot eyes. He reeked of alcohol and seemed to be in a panic. "Please, you have to help me," he begged, collapsing onto the seat across from me. "Someone's after me." I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But something about his fear seemed genuine, and I couldn't turn him away. I asked him what was going on, and he told me that he had witnessed a crime and was being chased by the perpetrators. As we talked, I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside. They were getting closer, and my heart began to race. The man with me panicked, and we both knew that we had to act fast. We hatched a plan to escape through the train's emergency exit. As we made our way down the hallway, the footsteps grew louder and more frenzied. We could hear voices, and they were getting closer by the second. We finally reached the emergency exit and opened the door, ready to jump off the train. But before we could make our escape, a hand reached out and grabbed the man I was with. He screamed in terror as he was dragged back onto the train, and I knew that I had to act fast. I jumped off the train and landed hard on the ground, my body aching from the impact. But I was alive, and I knew that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. To this day, I never found out what happened to the man who was with me. But I know that I will never forget the fear that I felt on that train ride home. I was on my way home from a work conference, taking the train back to my city. It was a long journey, and I was exhausted. As the train pulled into the station, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up over his head, and he was staring at me intently. I tried to ignore him and looked away, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. I started to feel uneasy and wished I had chosen a different seat. The man didn't seem to have any luggage with him, and he didn't seem like he was waiting for anyone. As the train pulled away from the station, the man got up and sat down next to me. He smelled strongly of alcohol, and I could tell he was drunk. He started to talk to me, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I pretended to be asleep, hoping he would leave me alone. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm and pulled me towards him. I screamed and struggled to break free, but he was too strong. I could see the fear in his eyes, and I knew I was in trouble. Just then, the conductor walked by, and I screamed for help. The man let go of me and tried to make a run for it, but the conductor tackled him to the ground. The man was arrested, and I was able to get off the train safely. It turned out that the man had been wanted by the police for a string of assaults on women traveling alone. He had been targeting women on trains, and I had almost become his next victim. From that day on, I never traveled alone on a train again. The experience had left me shaken, but I was grateful to be alive. I always kept a watchful eye out for any suspicious behavior, knowing that danger could be lurking around any corner. I was traveling by train from New York to Boston, a trip I had made many times before. It was late at night, and the car was mostly empty. I found a window seat and settled in, hoping to get some sleep before reaching my destination. As the train started moving, I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was wearing a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He seemed to be staring at me, but I couldn't be sure because of the hat. I tried to ignore him and close my eyes, but I could feel his gaze on me. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself that I was just being paranoid. However, every time I opened my eyes, he was still there, staring at me. Suddenly, the train lurched, and the lights flickered. When they came back on, the man was gone. I was relieved, but also confused. Had he moved to another car? I decided to get up and investigate. As I made my way through the car, I heard a strange sound coming from the bathroom. It was a low, guttural moan. I hesitated, not sure if I should investigate further, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the bathroom door open, and the sight that greeted me was horrifying. The man from before was inside, writhing on the floor and covered in blood. It looked like he had been attacked by something or someone. I was about to turn and run for help when the man grabbed my leg. He was still alive, and he was begging me to help him. I knew I couldn't leave him there to die alone, so I called the conductor and an ambulance. The man survived, but he was never able to tell me who attacked him. To this day, I can't help but wonder who or what was on that train with us that night.